All right. Uh, I see, True, you've got your hand raised, so go for it.
Well, I don't know if y'all have seen that video that my mind's going blank, that Tim posted about AI. It's like an hour-long video, YouTube, that came out in March, and just, the cautions and concerns about where we're kind of falling into because we're unable to manage AI. We're unable to track where it's going or how it's training itself, or anyway. So just a question about what would be some suggestions or recommendations for Gnostic practices around, how to, and I don't know what even to pray for, but just something, minimize chaos maybe, or something, if minimize any kind of chaotic impact, or, any kind of recommendations about that.
I think from that Gnosticism actually provides us a great way of thinking about structures like artificial intelligence, because it would be very easy to fall into a very simple dualism of saying, oh, AI is terrible, or AI is wonderful, it's going to save the world. Whereas the truth is that it is more often than not a question of how it's deployed. And I think that when most Gnostic thinkers look at the material world, it's a similar sort of comportment that, I don't think that there are too many who are simply Manichaean and say, the material world is fundamentally evil, but we recognize that it always poses a risk. And I think the same is true of any kind of technology. And the more sophisticated the technology is, the greater danger it presents, not because it is evil by its nature, but because it is subject to misuse. Of course, as a teacher, the prevalence of predictive language models like ChatGPT are making me absolutely crazy. Because there was an essay that was published, just a couple of days ago, with the title, and I wonder if it's the. Jonathan, did you just create an AI answer to that question? Because if you did, you may very well never become a priest in this church. But the essay essentially was entitled, "Dear Professors, we're using ChatGPT more than you can imagine." And I know that it's absolutely true. So how do we engage that as Gnostics, as Johannite, as people of faith? I don't think I have a good answer to that, but I think that our tradition situates us uniquely to address the problem thoughtfully and prayerfully, if not operatively. So I think it's that you're likely right, that it's largely about containing that chaos, about encouraging the right use of these technologies, so that the archonic aspects of them don't become dominant and don't contribute to the building of the Black Iron Prison, to use Philip K. Dick's terminology. So that's a really crappy answer to a really interesting question.
Well, I'm going to pile on, and I'm going to travel in the same direction as Mark Thomas. I don't know that my answer is going to be great, but I think Mark Thomas has got the right idea, right? I mean, narratively, mythologically, religiously, Gnosticism is always about the true versus the false, the real versus the artificial, right? You know, whether you've got the idea in terms of the reworking of creation, mythologies out of the Hebrew Bible, or ideas like the counterfeit spirit and the Apocryphon of John. There's always that particular thing where you're distinguishing between things, but at the same time, there's also that kind of, we like to say it's uncharacteristic, but the reality is characteristic positivity that you find in Gnosticism, the idea that the sacred flame or the divine is seated throughout the world. Even if we view the world to a certain degree as not being evil, but having a degree of unrealness to it, or an illusory quality, that there's something there, but we don't quite see what it is. And I think, one of those things, particularly that we talk about a lot with Gnostic mythology and Gnostic Christianity, is the idea of the world versus the system, right? And we have so many things. I mean, Monsignor Jordan Stratford years ago in an essay for his blog had a reference to talking about himself as the demiurge, and I think the line he had used, "The degree to which I'm a robot," is astonishing. As he said, there's a fundamental difference between morning and night, and 9 to 5, I've got to make this meeting, and I think my parking meter ran out of quarters, and those kind of things. One is kind of the underlying kind of structure of the universe and material existence, and the other is the thing that we've placed on top of it, right? I've heard folks refer to that distinction, for example, as chronos versus kairos. Chronos, of course, being time, but kairos being God time, right? And kairos would be, the cycles of the seasons, or day and night, or the time it takes to grow a baby. Chronos would be, it's 4:45 p.m. and I'm about to get ticketed, and my dinner reservation is for 5:30, and I think I'm totally going to miss it. One is the thing that we all kind of acknowledge as being there and being true and a consequence of living in the world, and the other thing is kind of what we've tried to package it in or repackage it and do it. And so I think kind of, we can't necessarily control, as Mark Thomas, the direction that Mark Thomas was going, we can't necessarily kind of, control what's out there or how it's being used, but we can control both how we approach it and how we interpret it or experience it. Lately, I've been doodling some notes on some workshops for seminarians. Not too long ago, we did one on how to include wellness principles and mental health, stuff like mindfulness, and bundle it into ritual and spiritual practice that you already do, so that effectively you can do both at the same time. And a follow-up one that I was going to do in dealing with kind of common human experiences that clergy are often called on to deal with is I was working on a follow-up for some time in the summer, which I probably still will do, on grief, because everybody experiences it. Grief isn't just death, it's any kind of meaningful loss. It could be of a job, a friendship, those kind of things. And, and I thought to myself, well, do I want to do this live or do I want to record it? And I said, well, I could probably get a lot more done and I could focus a lot easier. I mean, I love talking one-on-one. I don't like talking in front of crowds. For some reason, this feels different. But, and I thought to myself, I could probably stay on topic a little bit more, because I'm known for going all over the place, if I just kind of record it, right? And okay, well, how do I want to record this? Because typically when I talk in an environment like this, it tends to get contextualized by who I'm talking to, what kind of day I've had, that kind of thing. Well, maybe I'll record it. Okay, well, if I'm going to record it, I'm going to need to have a start, a middle, and an end. Well, how do I want to start it? And I'm used to, cracking jokes or making situational comments or that kind of thing. Well, I'll write an intro. I'll write an intro to this thing. And, and over the course of the week or two that I kind of debated this, there's all sorts of, friends and colleagues who are sending me random shit that they've generated through Chat GPT or, some other AI art type of thing. And some of it's the most ridiculous stuff you could think of. And some of it is frankly, incredibly clever. Bishop Tim Mansfield is entirely too good with this type of stuff, and so he's sent me some stuff that has actually made me gasp because it's pretty impressive. So I said, you know what? Okay, I'm gonna play along just like everybody does with those annoying photo filter apps or whatever. Everybody downloads it, they play with it for a little bit, and then it goes away. And I'm not sure if that's going to be the case with this because we're kind of getting an exponential quality here. But anyway, so I figured I would load it up, and I'll say, okay, write for me an intro to a pastoral workshop on grief, whose audience is, clergy and seminarians in a small heterodox church, that type of thing. You refine it a little bit. So after about 20 minutes of kind of refinement, it pumped out, a page or two of stuff, and I read it. And I thought to myself, holy shit, this is really good. This is really good. It covers everything I need to say. It tells you what it's the old tell people what you're going to tell them what you've told them, right? That kind of structure to giving a speech. And it had the perfect intro to doing that type of thing. And I paused for a second, I reread it, and I said to myself, if I sit and I read this, no matter how I look into the camera or do whatever, prompting, good light, all that other kind of stuff, mood music, whatever it is, if I do this thing, it's going to be immediately apparent. This does not sound like me whatsoever. Not at all. Not even a little bit. There are certain things that I could tweak or whatever. So immediately there became this kind of artificial thing where I've fed in all these bits that are like me, but what comes out is not me at all, right? And so there was this kind of Gnostic kind of moment of kind of, either, constructing the unreal with the real or constructing the real with the unreal, right? And, so I think it's a matter, much like anything else in terms of spiritual practice or intention working. I mean, we just did a workshop thing on Saint Expedite, where I think, when you come to the point where you're making the offering, where you're doing the tarot reading, where you're doing the prayer or the meditation, that your disposition is what sets the thing. I mean, if to get a little bit contextual, because you and I have met, right? So, I'm aware of your background and your training, right? The thing that a large, if not majority portion of what determines the success of a therapist-client relationship is the disposition of the therapist, right? And so there's at least as I understand it, I mean, that's not my thing, but how you approach it, how you view the opportunity for success with your client, that type of thing is going to affect how you interact with them. So the same type of idea, I think, applies here. I don't necessarily think it's an automatic evil, much in the same way that I don't think people are an automatic evil. You just add crowds or any type of, emotion order. So I think it has that same type of negative potential en masse, but we can't control that. We can only control this, where this is ourselves. So I think if we go into it with a degree of awareness of who we are, what we're seeking, why we're seeking it, then like any other tool, we're going to come out on the right side of it. That said, that may not stop, to quote one of my favorite sci-fi TV shows, which I'm currently engaged in a watch of, right? The avalanche has kind of already started. It may be too late for the pebbles to vote, right? And I mean, we don't know. We're all subject to and kind of witnesses of and participants in how that will play out or not. But I think in the same way, where we're dealing with real and artificial and imposed systems on, real systems or orders, kind of, we can approach it in the same way with the same degree of control, which some days is going to be more than others. I don't know. Does that help?
Yes. I just, my concern has to do with loss of control over personal mental space, where this YouTube goes on about, it describes how computers can read like energy in our brains, like MRI kind of thing, and can almost tell what we're thinking. So, can actually create pictures of what we might be imagining in our mind. So there's this personal thought space that we may not be able to protect, at some point. And, this is like even beyond identity safety, with your bank account or whatever. It's even beyond that. And so, what states or governments might use it to put, what they may attempt to use it for. So
I think individually, in terms of headspace and predictiveness and all that other kind of stuff. I can't account for the nuances of the state or not, but I think individually, we already exist in a space where that danger is there, in terms of things like cognitive distortion or bias or that kind of thing, even for how would I put it, old world kind of hard copy practices like the tarot or numerology in the Kabbalah, right? There's a certain thing where we can lead ourselves down the path. We can see what we want to see there. We can construct the particular thing. We can we can kind of predetermine, at least in our heads, kind of the outcome that we're secretly hoping for or not hoping for. So I think that kind of superimposition or kind of perhaps pool of Narcissus type of thing already exists. You know what I mean? Like it's already there. To be fair, this would be a significant escalation of that, with more consequences than me drawing the tower card 3 readings in a row or something like that, right? So yes, this is more tangible than that, but I think we have microcosms of that experience all the time, right? And so I think if we're mindful of the one, I think we can be kind of mindful of the other. That said, it may take more mental muscle, but this is also where the benefit of community comes in. The fact that you've raised the question, that we're having the discussion. There are other traditions, and we do it as well, but there are other traditions who have a fine and long history of enshrining the community as a kind of pillar of the thing. If you look at Buddhism with the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, right, where those things are functionally to a degree placed on par. And community is sanity making, it is grounding, it is reflective, it has those qualities. And I think to a certain degree it can kind of protect us from some of those dangers, in the same way that I think it protects us from the dangers of us losing our shit over magic or numerology or the tarot or anything that can kind of reflect back to us something we want to see or don't want to see, that type of thing. And that's kind of my ad. We're as much on the kind of frontier, the eternal frontier of the eternally unfolding world, as everybody else, right? So all we can do is kind of look at these things in real time, and what we lack in individual computing power, us versus a language model or those kind of thing, we make up for simply in numbers. And
this actually, I think, leads nicely on to Jeb's question that he's asked in the chat about resisting sort of the alienation that so many of us have experienced, not just in a technological world, though I think that is part of it, but in a Jeb, I thank you for the post-ish COVID life. Your lips to God's ears that we're in a post-COVID world. But I think that these are related questions in a very, very interesting way, because one of the things that happens during the isolation of COVID is that we became more dependent upon technologies to bring us together. And for me, it's another two-edged sword, right? Because on the one hand, here we are, having a conclave and a conversation with our brothers and sisters and siblings and colleagues and friends from Australia and Europe and North America, and we can do that because of the technology. So on the one hand, I think that the COVID isolation provided us with a new set of tools that we can use to form community and to connect with one another, but also gave us tools to isolate ourselves, and that's always the danger in these kinds of technological developments. For me, the best practice for creating community is being in a community. It's being with others, and whatever that means, whether that's something like this, or it's a liturgy that brings together a participatory community, or a discussion group, or even a casual coffee meeting. Being with others in whatever form that takes is the way that we foster that human interaction. I've frequently said that one of my favorite lines from the liturgy, and I was quoting it in something I was writing an hour ago, is the divine beloved manifested as this community, right? Not with the community or among the community, but as the community, that God is the community. And I've always found that very, very striking. I don't know the origins of it historically. I don't know, maybe His Eminence does, but the fact that we find God amongst our engagement with the other means that any engagement with the other gives us a possibility of the presence of God. And so again, I'm giving a really bad answer to a really, really good question, but in many ways, the answer to questions I so frequently find is that in order to do it, you do it. So I think that what you ask is really, really important, because we find ourselves in a place and time where being with others is increasingly challenging and increasingly important. And the hospitality that we show to the other is increasingly difficult and increasingly vital. So I think it's really, really important to ask those questions. And John's comment, I think, is absolutely spot on. Building a community takes work. It's not easy. So I mean, I can talk about my experience here in Chicago at St. Michael's. I have a great, very small group of very committed people, but expanding those boundaries is challenging. And as somebody who's working and raising a family and dealing, with everything that life has to throw at me, there hasn't always been time to forge that community. And that is, I think, a downward spiral, because if we don't put the work into forging those communities, we become increasingly isolated, which makes us less capable of dealing with all of the difficulties that we have to face.
And I am going to piggyback on that a little bit, but just from the practice perspective, though, I did want to follow up what Grace said with one particular thing, that I think there's a moment, if it hasn't happened already in Conclave, there's a moment where it will happen. And I'm sure folks have experienced moments in their other kind of virtual contexts, over the course of COVID time, is that there's invariably, when we connect virtually like this, or even through text or on the phone, I mean, yes, nothing replaces in person, but I think there's a moment where, we go through exercises and venues like this, where for a moment we forget that's the case. When we make a connection with another human being, there's a moment where we forget that we're sitting thousands of miles away from each other. And there's, whether it's in what somebody says or does, or what you hear, there's a thing where that kind of distinction kind of drops off. And I think that's true in general, even as, we hopefully exit COVID. For me, I think to do a double piggyback onto not only Mar Thomas's comments, but my own, is that, that isolation to a certain degree begins at home. Right. It begins in my own headspace. And this doesn't mean that what I'm experiencing out in the world, or the lack thereof, isn't tangible. It absolutely is. Right. It's kind of a feedback loop. But at the same time, I have to be able to kind of seek those connections and make those connections intentionally, where they can be found. From a practice standpoint, what I found is helpful, and I recently went over this with seminarians, and the best example I can think of is, for folks who aren't aware, we make our Divine Office available online, which is a set of practices and prayers and meditations that you use at different times a day. We've got 4 hours. Canonically, historically, you can have up to 9 hours. And when we say Office of the Hours, it's not literally every hour. Sometimes an hour is actually 3 hours, that type of thing. But generally, morning, noon, evening, and night is roughly how our hours come down. And the last hour of the day, Compline, is the one that I always make time for. And in Compline, there is a reflective practice, and the fact that it's reflective, of course, is alluded to in the archangelic prayer, because each one of these offices has as its kind of patron figure one of the 4 archangels that you see featured in our pretty much every liturgy and ritual that we do. And so the one for nighttime, of course, is Uriel, and the prayer goes, "Behold, Uriel comes robed in green, bearing a polished stone of reflection. Pray with us, Uriel, and join our prayer with yours." Right. And of course, the polished stone of reflection is a nod to the later practice that you have in Compline, where you're going through basically kind of the equivalent of a daily examen, where you're rewinding your day and you're looking at it. And it comes in 3 parts. The first part says, "In darkness and in silence, only you, beloved, hear my penitent heart." And at that point, you mentally call to mind all the shit that's gone wrong in the course of a day, whether you're responsible for it or not, doesn't matter. You know what I mean? All the negative experiences, all the less than happy experiences, everything that has not gone the way you wanted, however you want to phrase it, you recall that. And for me, I turn it into a visualization. I rewind and I go through, all the bad stuff of the day. And sometimes, to be honest, it's not pleasant, right? But then so I visualize that and I spend a minute or two with that. And then the next one says, with praise, I offer up the efforts and labors of this day. These offerings I give you, freely give for all the world. And then you recall all the things that you made a good effort on, all the things that were successful, all the things that had a positive effect that you participated in or were present for. Right. And so I spend time, visualizing those things. And sometimes it's as simple as me walking the dog and loading the dishwasher. Other times it's a successful wrangle with a doctor on a unit at the hospital that I work with, that type of thing. And lastly, there's a third one. With a joyous heart, I give thanks for the blessings of this day. And so I recall and visualize all the things that are good, all the things that are going right, all the things that I'm fortunate to have that I had no hand in spite of myself, right? And frequently, these are people, right? I have literally, as a part of this visualization, I have literally visualized this computer screen with everybody's face on it, because sometimes that's how I experience people. I'm grateful to have that particular thing. It always includes the face of my dog, my wife, all my fellow seekers, my parents, that type of thing. And there's an element there that, when you call them to mind, when you visualize them, when you call them to mind, you're making a connection there. It isn't just simply a thing where, oh, that's nice, warm and fuzzy. You can look at it from a spiritual perspective, right? If I let's say this is ye olden days when we didn't have smartphones in our pockets, and inside my wallet I have one of those $5 photo booth things that has like 4 pictures of my wife, right? When I pull that out of my pocket and I look at her face, immediately all of the experience that I've had with her comes to mind. Is that picture her? No, but it makes a legitimate connection to very real experiences in a very real person. This is how iconography works, right? You're not worshiping an icon, you're not venerating an icon, but you're establishing a connection between you and the entity behind it, right? And so visualization, and they don't have to be a saint to have that effect. God knows the people I know aren't saints. You know what I mean? But they don't have to be saints to have that kind of effect. And you can bundle that into other practices like compassion practices in Buddhism or Martinism or Metta, for example, right? Where you're visualizing those that you care about, that bringing those folks into your sphere, so to speak, creates that kind of connection. And particularly after I've gone through a visualization exercise, there's lots of times where I make a note, I'm going to write that person tomorrow, right? Because I don't know how they're doing. I don't know, so I'm going to reach out and I'm going to make that connection, right? So I think there's lots of ways where even kind of, because even when COVID goes away, I mean, the possibility for that isolation is still there. We get isolated in our jobs and our energy levels and, in our various communities and hobbies and those kind of things. So I think it's one of those things where, like the bit about AI, where, we've always had kind of microcosmic versions of those. Now it's just raised to the level of the macrocosm to become a part of the common human experience, though I do think it is more common than we realize if we just talk to each other, right? So I think kind of having those kind of reflective, perhaps gratitude practices to kind of spark that flame, as it were, is a good starting point to kind of carrying it out into the world and making it concrete. Oh, and Angie notes, proximity is the first root of attachment, is a source where the remainder 5 elements of a strong relationship form. We all went through a form of attachment damage after COVID, and it takes time and compassion to help build those roots up. Absolutely. Yes, we have a question up here. Let me scroll.
You're going to like this one.
God. If you guys weren't tired of me talking from the previous 2 questions, I've got good news or bad news for you. What is the story of how the AJC as a church began, including its overall perspectives or teachings? Well, first half of that question is pretty easy to answer, though it comes with all the ridiculousness of esoteric movements and independent churches. Quite simply, it started with an individual, right? It started with my predecessor, Bishop James Foster. Now, as the story goes,
It started in a hotel room.
it started in a hotel room, right? My predecessor, like many of us, member of multiple spiritual, religious, and/or occult organizations, was hanging out with folks for a conference and for a conference for another organization. And if you read our frequently asked questions, you already know that's the Temple of Set. So you know what I mean? We've been upfront about that for ages. You know, party time, get all your middle-aged goth friends together. As the story goes, there was an individual also himself connected to multiple organizations who was working on a kind of third or fourth project at the time in terms of some of the older Gnostic lineages, the Johannite lineage specifically, the Johannite tradition, whatever it meant at that time. And was interested to do it, but for whatever reason decided to abandon that project. But my predecessor expressing interest in doing that, essentially took it on. Now the story goes, of course, that there was a Episcopal consecration in that hotel room, which is the most believable part of the story, because if you've been around the Gnostic church or esoteric movement, all sorts of shit happens in bus stops and hotel rooms and back rooms and all that stuff. It's the horse trading I referred to in the previous talk. And so there, and I believe he was already a priest at the time, but that's a separate story and speculation. Who knows, when we post the video, maybe he'll chime in the comments. So, you know, he was consecrated at that point in time, a bishop, and decided to go forth and kind of, turn this into a thing. But it wasn't a thing right away. Originally, his project was to work on an esoteric group called the Friary, or the Order of the Sacred Flame, which obviously, you know, carries some leanings, you know, structure-wise from the left-hand path organizations he was involved in. Similar degree structure, that kind of thing, just framed more in terms of Golden Dawn type organizations. And so the Friary started first, and the AJC was an offshoot of the Friary. And myself, after, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, where I put the sex and the drugs ahead of the rock and roll so I didn't become rich, after I was coming out of the fog of all that, I had never abandoned my own spirituality, and I desire to kind of return to that formally, particularly because I felt that was somewhere I could be useful, because I've never been smart enough to be a doctor, or steady enough to, smart enough to be a teacher, steady enough to be a doctor, but here's something I can do because spirituality is a part of my thing. And so at the time I was looking for a Gnostic church, but instead I found the Friary. And so I ended up writing, because I was still interested in that. I'd been interested, practicing, reading about esotericism in some form or another since I was 16, 17. And this would have been, when I was 22-ish then, which is a long time ago now. And so I reached out and said, well, I can't find the thing I'm looking for, but I did find this, so maybe I'll do this in the meantime. And that's where I encountered my predecessor. And over the course of badgering to get him on the phone, because I didn't want to now I'm more comfortable with an email, right? But I decided essentially to, push him to flag him down so we could actually have a conversation about this. And apparently my annoyingness worked. And we had a long discussion about it. And I think I had encountered him because of a posting on a forum or a news group. And we had to talk about it, and out of that came the realization that he was ordained within the Gnostic stream. So I immediately said, well, that's what I really want to do. So, let's do it. And under a year, I was ordained far too quickly, but I ended up becoming his assistant for the next 3 years. Until just a little less than 3 years, actually, because the church was kind of formally established around 2000, and it actually got some activity and some momentum around 2001, which is when I got involved. And I think I was also initiate number 2 on the rolls for the Friary, number 1 being him, at least in terms of our email servers and whatnot. But yeah, I served under him for 3 years. And he had previously been involved in esoteric Buddhism, particularly Tibetan Buddhism, Vajrayana. And there was a group local to him, as I remember, and I'm going off my recollection. His might be a little bit different, but there was a group setting up shop not too far from him, and so he ended up deciding to stop in, and that kind of generated some feelings of nostalgia for the old ways, as it were. Where he was concerned, and he decided to help them out a little bit and get more involved. That ultimately led to him returning to that tradition for, I don't know, about a decade. He would eventually get involved again in Western esotericism and the Gnostic movement and whatnot sometime later. But he made the decision in 2003, July, to step down. So then I was left with the kind of, well, I think it's me and 3 other people at this point. I think we had 3 groups on the map, and mine was one of them. Not that it had really anybody at that point in time. And so I was kind of left with the decision of, well, do I carry this on, or do I just decide this is, too much work? It's too hard to, it would require too much energy to break orbit. So do I just, wrap it up? And I thought to myself, well, my vows aren't to him, right? My vows are to something bigger. That still holds, right? My vows were given to the divine and the community, and regardless of him, I have an obligation to fulfill those. And I also thought about folks like myself who, this was a place where they could go, where either their esotericism or, their fringe ideas about spirituality, or even their histories. Like I said, I did a lot of partying when I was a teenager. That doesn't make me an automatic fit in some organizations. And, if you're divorced, or if you're gay, or any number of things, doesn't make you a fit in other organizations, right? So I thought about the kind of avenue that would be closed if I closed this door. Right, that that if there's a place for me here, there are folks with a lot better reasons than me to find value here, and I kind of owe it. And I've always said historically in this chair that that we do the church for who we have, not who we'd like to have. But at that point in time, we didn't have a lot of people, right? But I knew that I don't believe myself either in the positive or in the negative to be an anomaly, right? To be an exception. And so I think, I knew that there had to be more folks out there like me for one reason or another that didn't feel comfortable somewhere else. So I said, okay, let's do it. And over the course of that time, I think a year later, Mar Thomas came on board, right? And 2 years after that, we have Bishop Scott, and so on and so forth. And so slowly, we've never really been good at proselytizing or marketing or any of those kind of things. We're still pretty shit at it. But word of mouth, mouth to ear, hand to hand, heart to heart type of thing, one person at a time, kind of making that kind of connection. You want to talk about breaking isolation? That's how you do it. One person, one moment at a time. And and folks will find their own reason to be here. They didn't need mine. Folks who have come here since, have brought immeasurably more and immeasurably, diverse backgrounds and difficulties and stuff like that. And that's kind of added to what we do, as we go. But yeah, that's roughly kind of how it started. Now, in terms of its overall perspective or teachings, those have evolved over time. When it started out, like I mentioned at the beginning of the recording, I don't know if this will make it into the edit, we've had several versions of our sacramentary, and kind of the sacramentary, our rituals always give you kind of the fence or the guardrail for kind of what we believe and what we do. There's an old saying, lex orandi, lex credendi, how you pray is what you believe, essentially. And so our rituals are always an indicator of that. And so back at Sacramentary 1.0, the one I was ordained with, the church was a lot more kind of Anglican, Anglo-Catholic in kind of language, a lot more Celtic saints, a lot more A lot more stuff, I guess, as you would say, kind of on the fringes of the empire, in this case, the Roman Empire, and kind of, any remnant elements within the church. And it was more magically focused in terms of the occult and esotericism than it was Gnostic focus. We've never, the funny thing is, we're well known as a Gnostic church, but we've never had Gnostic in our name. And sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes that's a bad thing, right? Forgive my dog, she's going crazy downstairs. But we've always had Johannite in our name. We've always had a focus on the Holy Saints John and the idea of the esoteric church or the hidden church of the Grail, those types of ideas. We've had public liturgies and private liturgies, and our private liturgies essentially were esoteric or magically focused. They were designed for people who were kind of, magicians by trade, but also sacramentalists at heart. And as we evolved, things gradually became more and more Gnostic. The sacramentary that we came out with the following year in 2002 is when we became explicitly Gnostic, in terms of including elements of classical Gnosticism. Now, kind of 20 years after that, we haven't shied away from that Gnosticism, but at the same time, we've also rolled in kind of some of our earlier kind of more magical elements kind of implicitly into our ritual, because that's still kind of who we are. You know what I mean? We're still a church that involves, initiates of all stripes. The difference is we don't market ourselves to initiates. We're a public-facing church that works with the public. And if you happen to like that kind of stuff, you're going to be at home. But if that thing's not your thing, you don't have to worry about being excluded by the fact that you don't do that stuff, right? So we've often joked that we're deep enough, nerdy enough, and dyed in the wool enough that you can bring your most hardcore Gnostic or occultist to this thing, but at the same time, 2 seats over, you can put your grandma. And
it's interesting because
there isn't going to be a problem.
There was a time when to be a priest in the Apostolic Johannite Church, it was required to hold a particular grade within the friary.
That's right.
That is no longer the case. And His Eminence and I have both talked about the fact that if we had retained that requirement, we would have lost a lot of really good people, some of whom are sitting in this room. So I think that, the idea that we are both esoterically minded and esoterically welcoming, but not exclusively that, is important to our identity. For me, there's an element of that if I think about my personal orientation to what it is that we do in the Apostolic Johannite Church, it can be summed up with the phrase primitive Christianity. That because I also hold that the primitive church was magically oriented, the primitive church was Gnostically oriented. Was it the same as the sort of ceremonial magic of the High Middle Ages? No. Was it the same as the classical Gnosticism described by Irenaeus? No. But I think that if you were to somehow magically transport yourself back to 57 AD, the church that you would find there would be magic. It would be ceremonial. It would be liturgical. It would be Gnostic. And in many ways, it would be Johannite. That is my belief. Have I got the time machine to test it out? Nope. So, so much for that theory. But, that's sort of how I face the AJC. And I think that's a way of sort of summing all of those elements up for me. And I'm not at this moment sort of speaking on behalf of the church. This is about my particular experience.
Jonathan, you have your hand raised.
Yes, we're sort of continuing that the topic, maybe it's an obvious question, maybe it isn't, right? But if you go to the AJC website, it says a Gnostic and esoteric church. But would you think that it's fair to say a Gnostic, esoteric, and mystical or contemplative church? If I'm somebody who's quote unquote just interested in meditation and contemplation, like those are a just, right? Because that is a whole path. Is the AJC a welcoming place for me? And if so, is there some way that we can emphasize this even more? Because we do have these different strands, different interests, what have you, and as is evidence said, kind of jokingly, but kind of seriously, we're not always the best in marketing or proselytizing. I can't say that very well, but at the same time, we're not a proselytizing church, right? We put out the shingle. We're not trying to make converts, but at the same time, I think there is a need and a want for this mysticism that might be outside of the Gnosticism and this is a leading question, by the way, but outside of the Gnosticism and sort of magical traditions. And I think finally, I'm asking this question because it's something that Jason and I talk a lot about, and sometimes we talk about it with His Eminence. But I'm not the king of Gnosticism, who's the only person who knows how to do it right. And year to year, moment to moment, day to day, I change my mind about what Gnosticism is or was, even thinking about the ancient Gnostics. But there does seem to be kind of a strain on the internet where Gnosticism is all about kind of like a heavy metal approach, or a fantasy or sci-fi book where it's like I'm gonna go kill the demiurge, right? It's all about this very like the demiurge is Sauron, right? And also I hate my body, and the whole point of the world, the whole point of this tradition is to get out of it and get to somewhere's better. And I'm not always sure when you combine all of that together, perhaps with isolated people, if that's psychologically healthy. So sometimes if that's what people think Gnosticism is that always good when we're trying to reach people? I don't know if I'm making any sense, but anyways, a clarification on the mysticism, the contemplative, the meditative.
I'll
As
take
usual, you're not making any sense.
Okay, good. Yeah,
I'll take a speed run of that. I mean, I would say absolutely, because so our statement of principles, which is prominent on our website and is one of the older documents of the church historically. I mean, it's not designed to create belief or enforce belief. It's designed to reflect it. And for the majority of our history, and we do sit and reevaluate these things from time to time, that's reflective of the overall kind of common experience of most people that come here. Now, it's not absolutely true. We have one on the Trinity, but at the same time, we have folks who are adoptionists in this call, right? So it isn't absolute, but it is kind of an outline. In the first statement that we have, about gnosis, we talk about how gnosis is simultaneously knowledge of the self and knowledge of the divine, that essentially these things go hand in hand, and anything that brings you closer to one implicitly brings you closer to the other. And contemplative practices kind of go in exactly both those directions. In fact, they implicitly link them. The funny thing is we do get people who come here because they view their parent traditions, and everybody here now, we're starting to have people kind of born and raised in the church environment, but the majority of the church is still, everybody comes from somewhere else, right? And so we've had a handful of people who have come here precisely because they haven't found that esotericism or that mysticism in their home tradition. And if we're being honest, and we always try to do so, we tell them, no, it actually is where you came from, and you're going to find some of that here, right? We're not going to reinvent the wheel. We are standing on the shoulders of much more organized traditions. I won't necessarily say older, because Gnosticism is pretty old. It's just not continuous in the way that we think of it, right? But those practices are found in Christianity. Those practices are found in Buddhism, and where they're useful, we have included them in terms of talking about them as toolkits or avenues for exploration. I think if I were to revise the statement of principles now in terms of the statement around gnosis, I would add something about it being the subjective experience of objective spiritual reality, right? And so there's a particular thing, or to steal a point from another tradition, there are as many gates as there are people. So I think there's a thing where, contemplative practice, mystical practice, meditative practice, is an inroad into the self, and as a byproduct or an intentional product, an inroad into the divine. So we absolutely welcome that, right? I mean, we're dealing with the reality of the ineffable. We are trying to put human words on the not human, and there are lots of places where you can find methods and means by which to attempt to do that. There are not, however, lots of places where you can talk about what happens if you do. And this remains an environment where you can have that discussion. You can talk about the results of your practice. You can talk about the difficulties, the dry spells, the negative self-encounters, traumatic recollections, ecstatic moments of joy, right? So I think we very much welcome those practices, and more so, we welcome the discussions that happen after those practices, because even if we don't nail down the divine into a sentence or two, the reality is this kind of experience, this kind of thing, both going after it and having it, is functionally relational, right? The Trinity is functionally relational, right? And I think so anything that allows us to have that relational experience, and to throw out a easy example, love, right? Anything that touches on that relational thing, it brings us closer. So we have the opportunity to not only talk about the things that bring us to that point, we have an opportunity to go to that point simply by engaging what happens after and providing an environment for it. The other thing it also strengthens our diversity. It strengthens our understanding. I have often said, learn from the mistakes. I stole this from a friend of mine. Learn from the mistakes of others, because you won't live long enough to learn from your own. The same is true of successes. The same is true of self-encounter. And I learn as much about myself by having these conversations with folks, more so than any conversation or interaction I may have with myself. So there is an opportunity. It isn't just the thing that leads you to gnosis. It's these kind of experiences right here. So yes, the short answer is 2 thumbs up on anything contemplative. What do we got here?
It's interesting, while His Eminence is scanning through the chat for the next question. It's interesting because the contemplative element is something that I think became more prominent with the work of Martimotheos. It was an important part of his spiritual journey and his spiritual work, and so it was wonderful to have somebody who spearheaded that as an important factor in or element of what it is that we do.
I'm just going to see a comment from Christina that says she came to the AJC through finding a parish after Googling Gnostic masses and shockingly finding one in her town. Having said that, she was 100% terrified that she was walking into an adult LARPing about knights vibe, and was glad to see that was not the case. There was an ample amount of room for the mystical, contemplative, and messy intersections of life. The thing is we crack off about the LARPing thing and the knights vibe from time to time, because unfortunately we're surrounded by it. I mean, there are other churches and esoteric groups that are kind of exactly that, and to and I mean, to be sure, we joke about the trappings. Like we talked about the fact that all of our sections about vestments and stuff in our sacramentary, have remained shockingly accurate throughout the years. But, some of the other details haven't, because we haven't paid attention to them. So it shows you where the focus goes, right? But at the same time, there's a recognition that this is a public church. We are out in the world and, and trying to, walk with each other and alongside other folks. And there's time for the claptrap. There's time also where the claptrap points your focus in a particular direction. But at the same time, when you arrive at that space, it actually has to be about serving people and actually engaging the practices and spiritual stuff, right?
That said, I'm not above swinging a sword around when necessary.
Sure, absolutely. As a previous conclave speaker, once said, transformation isn't what happens, 5 minutes before you walk into the church, right? Or it shouldn't be. And, I mentioned recently in the thing for seminarians that if, the only time you're, as clergy, if the only time you're thinking about the spiritual life is when behind the altar, you don't have a spiritual life, you have a job. And if you're a member of the laity, and the only time you're thinking about spiritual stuff is in times like this, or when you're sitting in the pews, you don't have a spiritual life, you have a hobby. Right. So there has to be a thing in which we kind of like it gets illustrated there. When we do stuff here, it's the concentrate to a certain degree, right? But unless it has that outside stuff for every other moment in time, it's going to be meaningless. Going to a therapist or a priest or a teacher is fantastic. But if that's the only time you're caring about that particular thing, if you're not carrying it out into the other 23 hours of the day, you're going to be in trouble. So yes, there is an element where, particularly because, we have the Knights Templar and our esoteric history and mythology and all this other kind of stuff and robes and stuff, where certainly, we haven't divorced ourselves totally from that thing, but at the same time where you have to kind of put it into perspective and kind of like questions, right? They should either lead you towards something or they should lead you away from something. So we kind of have to reevaluate those things as we go and say, is this leading us to somewhere where we want to be, or is this leading us away from where we don't want to be, and so on and so forth, and kind of make sure that those landmarks and those compasses and those things still hold, which is why we do examine our rituals and our vestments and all our other kind of stuff from time to time, and even our statement of principles. It has to be reflective of reality as opposed to attempting to create it. Because if we're solely and only attempting to create it, we are in a fantasy. And yes, as Father John points out, one of our liturgies is contemplative, and that comes from the work of Mar Timotheus. It was inspired by he had taken a retreat with the noted contemplative and Episcopal priest Cynthia Burgot. He had done a retreat either with her or with folks doing her work. I believe it was with her. And coming out of that, he produced a contemplative Eucharist, which kind of came fully armed from the head of Zeus with very little modification, because in my opinion, it was a genius work, and it still remains something that gets used quite frequently in the AJC. It's also the easiest mass to pack for when you're leaving work, because it's very simple. I can put it all in a bag, and but it puts the emphasis on silence. I mentioned before the experience of each other and divine in particular simultaneously. It's relational, and kind of like music, part of the composition, part of the genius of music isn't just the notes, it's the silence in between them, right? That remains that kind of running layer and structures and punctuates things. And so we have a liturgy that puts that kind of emphasis on the silence. And ultimately everything comes from that contemplative silence as well. To use an example, if I take a table and I put a book on top of the table, then I put a book on top of that book, then I put another book on top of that book, the table is still there. Even with the sound of my voice, silence is underneath it. It remains a running thing, that no matter how much noise you have, the silence is under the thing. And being aware of that, you can connect to it even in the midst of noise. The same is true of the divine out in the of the word of the world, right? So. Focus on the sword and you miss all that heavenly glory. But what if the sword is really shiny?
Yeah, I mean, some of our swords are really cool, so.
My wife thinks the sword is the weirdest part of the Theocletian liturgy. That's the thing she doesn't.
Really? That's the thing she thinks is weird?
Yeah.
There's a lot of weirdness in the Theocletian liturgy, and that's what she thinks is weird. Okay.
I always tell that, compared to our ancient counterparts, everybody here at a liturgy, the AJC, has it easy, because the further back you go in time, the longer the liturgy is, and the less you are allowed to sit. So you could be standing for hours, and that's still true in Eastern Orthodoxy, right? And and in some cases you could stand there for several hours, and then because you weren't baptized or confirmed, after going through all that, they would kick you out, because you weren't allowed to see the central stuff of the Mass. So, folks who have a hard time sitting through 45 or 60 minutes of liturgy, you're weak.
Yes. Come to the Theocletian Rite and we'll make you stand for an hour and a half. So, and that's still easy.
I try to lean up against the wall or something, or, on other clergy.
Right. Well, that's what deacons are for.
But it could be that I've had too much of the blood of Christ.
All right.
Your Grace, I was expecting you to throw in the, is this really the blood of Christ joke?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm off my game today. So
A young new communicant goes to Mass for First Communion for the first time, and afterwards asks the priest, "Father, was that really the blood of Christ?" "Why, yes, it was, my son." "Wow, Jesus must have been like totally wasted."
But
Any other questions? We are nearing our time for a break before we prepare for the ordeal that no one has to stand for, Marthamas's talk. So unless there are any last second questions or comments, we will jump into that break so everybody can run around the block, use the bathroom, grab a coffee. Thank you, folks, for some excellent questions. Those were great.
yeah, both the very specific and the very general questions led us in great directions.
I love this stuff. You guys are brilliant.